All right. Well, welcome everybody. We're really glad that you're here and that you're interested in learning more about how to apply for an LCAN grant to start a new LCAN in fiscal year 2022. Kind of hard to believe that we're already there and thinking about the next fiscal year, but here we are. Just as a quick reminder, we try to encourage everyone to participate in or watch the recording of the webinar that we had in January around using collective impact to increase college attainment, because this is really a follow-up. So that webinar provides you with some good context for this one and sort of helps you figure out if perhaps you do want to move forward with an LCAN application. So just a reminder to check that one out as well if you have not already. We're going to talk to you today a little bit about Iowa College Aid and the Community Engagement Division where the LCAN grant lives. And then we're going to talk to you about the application itself in terms of the narrative and what you would be expected to submit along with your grant. The RFP, the request for proposal, will be available April 1st. So, but this will give you some good information so that if you do want to move forward with applying, you can start laying that groundwork even before the RFP comes out. I'm Ann Thomas, I should say. I am the lead on the LCAN grant at Iowa College Aid. And my colleague, Megan Sybil, heads up the College and Career Readiness Academy and also serves as a consultant to multiple LCANs around the state. And then we have Tressa with us from our communications department who will be our technical support and be running our slides for us. We're really glad to have Tressa here with us today. At this time, I'm going to hand it over to Megan to kick us off.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. As Ann said, I'm going to dive just a little bit into talking about our community engagement division, because if you were to apply for an LCAN grant and be awarded, this is sort of the realm of Iowa College Aid in which you would live. So we just want to give kind of a refresher on our community engagement programs and take a deeper look at how LCANs interact with our other programs. On our next slide, you can see, again, just want to revisit briefly what we are about at Iowa College Aid. Our sort of core focus is our belief that college changes everything. But we also, again, want to emphasize in the context of LCAN specifically that when we mean college, and when our LCANs talk about college, we're looking at types of post-secondary ed opportunities beyond the typical four-year degree, right? So we're talking about certifications, we're talking about trades, two-year schools, and of course 4 years as well, four-year schools as well. So again, in terms of thinking about an LCAN and what its potential focus could be, do keep in mind that outcomes, where ultimately students or adult learners or whoever the demographic group might be, where they're ultimately headed can look different, right, depending on the individual or the focus of the LCAN. So we do want you to keep that in mind as you're looking ahead and planning for a potential LCAN. Excuse me, I do have a little bit of a cold, so my apologies for any sort of coughing and hacking along the way. Again, just wanted to reconnect our conversation today to our previous webinar and talk a little bit about our community engagement programs. So you can see LCAN there on the far left and sort of the ticking through the other programs that make up community engagement at Iowa College Aid. And we do see quite a bit of overlap, quite a bit of intersection between LCAN, for example, and the Academy, our Course to College program. Not so much our Gear Up program, although there can be some intersection there. I will say, if you were to join the LCAN team, we would encourage you to look at exploring our AmeriCorps Access and Success program. Just briefly, this is a program that provide that supports AmeriCorps members going into, for example, high schools and helping students complete their FAFSA, fill out a college application. This is a program that's housed at Iowa College Aid, but we've seen great success in terms of supporting, sort of connecting the dots between LCANs on the one hand and bringing in an AmeriCorps member into communities. So again, if you were to move forward, interacting with these community engagement programs is something that that we would encourage and like to see happen. Our next slide includes just a map to give you a visual of where our community engagement programs exist and what they look like there. We don't have the academy participants, which are wide ranging and across the state. Other than that, though, you can see where the Gear Up schools are, where our current LCANs are located, where we have our AmeriCorps members placed across the state. So if you're looking again at completing an application, you know, it would definitely help to familiarize yourself, to learn a bit about, you know, if any of these programs are in your community or nearby. That's something important to include and to think about as you would be putting together an application for an LCAN. Zooming in just a little further on our LCANs themselves, as you'll note, most of our LCANs are geographic focused, but we do have 3 statewide networks: our Latinos CAN, our opt-in CAN, and our Queer Supports Advisory Team. So again, thinking about what your interests might be in regarding LCAN, it could be, you know, if you're from an area of the state where we don't have a presence, you know, that would be something that would help, you know, I think bring something additional to your application, right? Or if you're considering developing an LCAN that would support college access for an underserved community that we don't already work with, that would be another sort of element to consider that we would be very interested in seeing. So take a look at this map, kind of think about you and your leadership team potentially in reference to this, and this will sort of help guide that conversation in terms of what's already out there and what new could this potential LCAN bring to the table. Just a little bit more on the LCAN grant series and what we see as our overarching goal and our funding focus and our vision. Really, we're about increasing college attainment through collective impact, which of course we spent some time talking about in the previous webinar. Our funding focus is important, again, as you consider whether or not this is a program that you would like to pursue. We fund a framework, not new programs, and this really relates back to the sort of theory and framework behind collective impact, which is that, you know, we don't create new programs as LCANs. We look to discover what's already out there and align existing programs around the LCAN's goals. The theory behind that being that, you know, when we look at complex social issues like educational access or workforce related issues, a one-off program isn't likely over the long term to solve that issue. So just creating another program really isn't going to get to that systems change that we focus on in collective impact. It's really about aligning partners in the community around this shared vision. So speaking of vision, our LCAN vision is that through collective impact, LCANs will leverage and align existing resources to increase college attainment. So really kind of coming back to that core focus of LCAN, which is about aligning what's already existing in a community, identifying barriers, and seeking to reduce those barriers. So our LCAN grants at a glance document, Tressa, would you be able to click on that and open that link for us?
Is it showing up for you guys yet?
It should. It's loading, but yep, there it is.
Perfect.
So this is just a handy sort of reference. It's a high level overview. of our grant series. So as you can see, you know, we sort of articulate the phases of the grant. So you all would be in the sort of exploratory pre-application phase. And then the document walks you through year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, right? So as we, I think, discussed in the last webinar, this is a 4-year grant series, and we like to sort of make sure our LCANs are setting themselves up for success in terms of, you know, should you get into, you know, have a successful application for year 1, you would reapply for year 2, and year 3 and year 4. But again, in terms of our technical assistance and support, we would set you, you know, look to do all we can to set you up for success to move through the sort of sequential years of the grant program. And this is a document that's available on our website. You know, we'll share this out if you want to dig into it a little further, just to sort of, again, get that high level view of, okay, well, what is it that we would be doing as an LCAN from year to year? This provides that overview. And then the document continues kind of on that back page with just a little bit more narrative around, you know, the year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and the grant series more generally. So we'll make sure to provide that with everyone, provide that to everyone rather. Okay, so our funding priorities. When we think about LCAN, when we look at you know, uses to which these grant funds could be put, our next slide kind of gives you another high level sense of where these funds would be utilized. So the bulk of grant funds typically go to support the LCAN coordinator position, right? So the person who's taking direction from the leadership team, helping to coordinate the work of the action teams who are sort of the boots on the ground doing the work. Supporting that position is the top priority for the grant funds. We've seen over the years how crucial it is to have a strong LCAN coordinator. And while we do have some coordinators currently who are part-time, we have seen again that really it would be best practices to get a full-time coordinator, again, to do the work of helping to align not only the network, the LCAN itself, but the broader partners in the community as well. So that would be our sort of top funding priority. We also, LCAN funds can be used to support travel and training. This year, of course, for so many reasons, has looked different than other years in terms of travel and training. There are a couple of trainings that we would typically ask or recommend that LCAN coordinators and some leadership teams actually travel to attend. And again, that's something that would we would talk more about if you were to move forward successfully with an LCAN grant. Materials and supplies are part of the sort of allowable expenditures for our LCANs, and we do provide support for indirect costs as well. So these sort of core 4 elements are what we prioritize in terms of our LCAN funding. So just in terms of why these are our priorities and why do we focus on them, we really believe that these priorities and this focus in our LCAN programs really do help to build these strong community partnerships, to demonstrate our commitment to increasing college attainment rates, commitment to equity and inclusion, and importantly, building representation from cross-sector CEO level leaders. And our successful applicants will really sort of demonstrate commitment to these priorities throughout your proposal that you would ultimately submit. So if we're sort of asking if we're ready for an LCAN grant, we would want you to, again, think about these 3 preconditions for a collective impact initiative. You know, really sort of ask of yourselves, ask of a planning group if you already have that in place. Do you have, you know, your champions identified? Who's going to really lead the work in a visible public way in the community such that others would be sort of inspired to follow their lead. Financial resources, right? This is where, you know, the grant comes in, but certainly is there appetite to sustain the work over the long term? Collective impact is a long-term process, and a 4-year grant is enough, hopefully, to get the work established. But if we're looking at outcomes, right, that's something that might not become visible for, you know, several years after that, right? So making sure that there is an appetite there for long-term financial sustainability is something we encourage applicants to think about if that's present. And finally, this urgency for change that we talked about in our last webinar as well. Is there that desire among the community to really dig in and address issues related to college attainment, related to workforce, whatever that, you know, whatever that looks like? Is that urgency for change present? Again, sort of sharing some food for thought in terms of what successful applications look like. Again, we want to make sure that you know, a new LCAN would cover a geographic area that's not currently covered, or an underrepresented population that's currently not being addressed. And sustainability is an important piece of that overall application as well. Our successful applications also demonstrate a commitment to addressing in a meaningful way how to reduce barriers for low-income students, for students of color, for first-generation college-going students. And again, kind of connecting back to the ways in which LCAN lives in our broader community engagement division, we would like to see some familiarity with these programs that we've discussed previously. A few more elements to keep in mind in terms of what an application might look like. We would want to see a problem statement, and we'll spend a little bit more time on that here momentarily. We want to see that influential leaders are being convened. And again, getting back to that financial resources piece. We want to at least have a sense that that's a conversation that's happening. You know, in an initial application, you're not going to know what that might look like, but having those conversations and being able to demonstrate that those conversations are being had is an important step early on in the process. So the grant narrative is a piece of the application, right? So you'll submit a grant narrative, you'll submit some attachments that Anne will be talking about, and a budget. So in terms of the grant narrative portion of the application, we want to see a plan for developing a leadership team. At this early phase, like, you're not going to have your full leadership team in place, and we wouldn't expect you to. But we would like to see a plan for how are you going to connect with these community leaders who need to be bought into this process to make it be successful. Another important piece of this is considering who would be a 501c entity to serve as your fiscal agent. The LCAN itself is not a 501c. We have, for example, LCANs whose fiscal agent is the local United Way. We have a couple who utilize the local Iowa State Extension Office as their fiscal agent for that purpose. So you need to have that piece in place, certainly, to continue forward. Again, back to that leadership team element, when we talk about identifying influential champions and building our leadership team, we want to see cross-sector partnerships emerging from these different sort of areas within the community. So again, in thinking about putting a plan together for building a leadership team, these are the sectors that we would want you to really focus in on. And then to dig a little further into this problem statement that we would want to see articulated in the application. This really gives you a sense of what exactly we mean by that and what we're looking for, right? So a concise picture of college attainment in your community that contrasts the current state with the desired state, right? Where we are now and where we're wanting to get to over the long term by utilizing LCAN, by utilizing collective impact. And this is really where, bring some research in, bring some data in to support your problem statement, to support the sort of driving force why why, to sort of illustrate why having an LCAN is important and why focusing on these issues in your community would be important. And then finally, before I hand it off to Anne, we wanted to include just a sample problem statement. You know, we do have a lot of LCANs that focus on FAFSA completion rates because we know that FAFSA completion correlates to eventual enrollment in post-secondary ed opportunities. So, you know, typically we see LCANs with a bit broader of a problem statement, but we wanted to include this because FAFSA completion is a common area that many of our LCANs tend to focus on. Okay, and with that, I am going to turn it over to Anne to sort of walk through the rest of the application and attachment process.
Thank you, Megan. So I am going to spend some time talking to you about the attachments that go along with the application. And these are really important. These are basically what you're using to set the foundation for deliverables of the grant later on, should you be awarded a grant. And so if we can go ahead and go to the next slide, let's go back once. So the required attachments are your preliminary resource map, your list of prospective leadership team members that Megan referenced. So keeping in mind that cross-sector representation that we're looking for, letters of commitment, the LCAN coordinator position job description. So you will be working with your partners to develop that job description to submit with the grant application. And then a work plan demonstrating how you would meet the deliverables of the year one grant. Next slide. So the preliminary resource map. The idea with the preliminary resource map is that you are taking a look at the resources that exist in your community. As Megan referenced, the LCAN grant is designed not to build new programs, but to leverage existing resources. So we have to see and understand what programs and resources currently exist in the community around college attainment before we can, you know, really build on those and leverage them. We're also looking to get an idea of are there any duplications? Are there gaps? And are there overlaps in services in your community? And then on the next slide, just a couple of tips on building your preliminary resource map. We want you to focus on college access resources. This can sometimes include resources that are not traditionally thought of as college access resources. Examples of that would include transportation and childcare. So we have LCANs that have already done a lot of work on identifying what are the specific barriers in their community to college attainment. Transportation and childcare are examples that come up a lot. So you might factor that into your resource map. But one thing we would encourage you to do is keep in mind the mission of the organization that you're including in your resource map, so that you're not sort of going too far out and including, you know, all of the nonprofit or human service organizations in your community in that resource map. It should still have that focus on what resources there are around college attainment. And then you're going to establish buckets or categories of college access resources that do exist and begin to fill in those buckets. And then on the next slide, can we go back one? And one more? If we could click on that example. This is just one illustration, and it's kind of difficult to convey what a resource map looks like in this type of setting, and we're happy to provide you with some examples from our existing LCANs. But you can see that it's color-coded. It lists the different services that organizations in the community provide, and it also lists where in the community they work. So what organizations are they working with? So that's just to give you kind of a high-level idea of what a resource map can look like. And then next, we're going to talk about that list of leadership team members. And so as we talked about, again, we're looking for that cross-sector CEO level leadership. And then on the next slide, we will talk a little bit about who, again, belongs on your leadership team. So we're looking for decision makers that represent that broad spectrum of local sectors and constituencies. The leadership team members are responsible for providing the strategic direction for the network. And the role on the leadership team should be embedded in the organization of the leadership team member. So we're not just looking for commitment from an individual, but from a partner organization. And then next slide, please. We want you to include in your list of leadership team members those that are already committed. This might be the group that you're working to plan and write the grant with, and then also prospective members. So if we think back, and you may reference back later to that illustration of the cross-sector representation that we're looking for, it's important to understand that this goes beyond K through 12 schools and higher ed. We're looking for the entire community to be supporting college attainment. So we want you to list names, titles, organizations, and then whether they've committed to joining the leadership team and what sector they represent. So it's okay, if you don't have all those sectors represented right now, just to talk about those sectors where you're doing work to bring people in. Another thing that I want to talk about is that it's representation really matters with LCAN. Megan referenced the fact that we are prioritizing underserved populations. If you're not able to get that sort of lived experience represented on your leadership team through seeking out the CEO level leadership, we want you to dig deeper into are there community members that could in some way be a part of your leadership team. We have an LCAN that actually includes students in their broader leadership team network. Since we're looking to identify, what really are the barriers to college attainment, we have to have that that voice at the table of the people that are living and that have tried to navigate the higher ed system themselves. And then next slide, please. Next, we're going to talk a little about letters of commitment. We want you to include 5 to 7 letters of commitment with your application. And so again, this is where we're looking for buy-in, not just from the leadership team member, but from the organization. And we want that to address in as much detail as possible, what are the issues facing the community? And then just to demonstrate that your partner, has an understanding of the issue and also a commitment to the LCAN and to sustainability after the life of the grant. And so next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the coordinator job description itself. We really believe strongly in the importance of a leadership team and LCAN coordinator in order to keep things moving with the grant. We believe strongly that that's part of what makes this different than other initiatives or task forces that people maybe have to be a part of. We invest a lot of training and a lot of funds into this position. And so you will be tasked with crafting a job description for this position when you submit your application. And so just to give you an idea of what would go into that job description, the primary job, clearly, as the name states, is for the coordinator to coordinate the work of the LCAN and coordinate existing community resources. They are building work groups based on the priority areas or the goals that are identified by your leadership team, and they serve as a liaison between the leadership team, work groups, and your community. This is someone that's a momentum builder. They're making sure that there's continuous communication happening between leadership team meetings and between work group meetings. And then the next slide, I believe, demonstrates what we feel are the core competencies for an LCAN coordinator. So these are also things to think about when you're building your job description. These are things that we also work to provide consultation and professional development around once a coordinator is hired. Another thing to consider with the job description is, we recommend best practice that this is a full-time position. However, we recognize that that is not always possible. We are to the point now where the majority of our LCAN coordinators are full-time, but we have several very talented part-time coordinators. It's important that if this is a part-time position or a shared position, that needs to be clearly outlined in the job description. So for example, if you're thinking we're going to build a position that's 75% LCAN coordinator and 25% focused on some other initiative, that needs to be outlined in the job description and line up with what is in your budget in the application. Next slide, please. So your work plan, this is where you are going to build out a plan that demonstrates how you're going to complete the deliverables in year one of the grant. So just a little overview of what you would be asked to do in year one. This is also outlined in that grants at a glance document, and it will be in the RFP as well. But you're hiring that coordinator. So when you're applying for the grant, you have the job description ready. And then if you get a grant, then you're going to go out and hire a coordinator. You're formalizing your LCAN team structure. So working to build that leadership team, and then developing those work groups over time and making sure that the fiscal agent is neutral, but is keeping things running smoothly. So the fiscal agent is administering the grant. Oftentimes the fiscal agent is who houses the coordinator, serves as the home office for the coordinator. That leadership team roster is a deliverable. So you will be building out that list of leadership team members. And then developing an MOU for your LCAN team, renewing your letters of commitments and getting new letters of commitment, identifying those SMART goals, and then identifying the priorities that those work groups will work on in year two. What we're looking for with your work plan, there is not a required format, but if you don't have one to work from, Gantt charts work really well. What we're looking for is to make sure that, all of the deliverables are in your work plan with an estimated date for completion, and then also objectives underneath each of those deliverables. So how are you actually going to meet those goals, breaking it into smaller tasks, and then identifying, who is going to be the person or the party responsible for getting that done. And then next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the budget, and if we can go ahead we'll talk about indirect costs. Megan already highlighted the funding priorities, which essentially are the allowable costs for the grant. I did want to highlight that we do cover indirect costs up to 12% if there is a federally negotiated indirect cost rate, and 10% if there isn't one. And indirect costs can be utilized, either submitted as for reimbursement on the grant, or it can be used as match. And in some instances, we will allow you to go beyond that 12% if you have unrecovered costs and use that as match. The budget is entered directly into an application on iowagrants.gov. The template will be provided with the RFP so that you can do some planning around that with your partners. And then next slide. One thing that I want to state that's not in the slides is that this is a reimbursement-based grant. So it is not a grant where you receive all of your funding, at the onset of the grant year. You would be approved for a certain amount, and then, expenses have to be incurred and documented and submitted for reimbursement on a monthly basis. The match requirement for this grant in year one is 25%. Years 1 and 2 have a 25% match requirement. Years 3 and 4 have a 50% match requirement. And, that's because we want you to be moving towards sustainability. Cash and in-kind match are both allowable. We do not at this time have a requirement around how much of your match has to be cash and how much is in kind. However, we are looking to see, if you have those financial resources in your community, if you have the buy-in from your partners so that this can be sustained after the life of the grant. So it is a factor. It's something to think about when you're asking for those letters of commitment, asking those partners, what are you able to provide, whether it is in-kind match or cash, or whether, perhaps they're starting out with in-kind, but thinking down the road about how they would, contribute in a financial way. Responsibility for match should be shared amongst partners. So we don't ever want it to be that the fiscal agent is providing all of the match for a grant. And this demonstrates buy-in. Again, it demonstrates that you have those conditions in your community where an LCAN, a collective impact initiative, could thrive. Next slide, please. So appreciate Tressa being our assistant with this today. Just some examples of in-kind match. Leadership team members' time outside of leadership team meetings. So there will be an expectation that once your leadership team is formed and up and running, that you're having regular monthly meetings. That is sort of just baked into the grant. And so that isn't time that you could then use as match on the grant. However, if leadership team members are meeting outside of those, the leadership team time, or they're contributing their expertise in other ways, that can be used as match. Donated goods and services, space for events, and food. Again, we haven't seen so much of that this year, but we're hopeful that we will go back to a time when we're meeting in person. And, food in the past has been something that we encourage people to use the grant for, because we find that giving people food, it can really bring people together. It can kind of set the tone for your meeting. Special discounts can be utilized as match. So for example, if you were able to get some marketing materials at a reduced rate for your LCAN, you could use that as match. Something, if it's a discount that's offered to the general public, like, there's a 50% off pizza deal, that's not something that you can use as match. Employee time, this is a big one, such as a dedicated supervisor. So this is where that fiscal agent can come in on match a lot of the time, because if they are serving as the home organization for the coordinator, that coordinator is going to have a supervisor that is providing some oversight and contributing to the LCAN. And so, it may be that 10% of that position for the year is dedicated to LCAN, and that is something that can be utilized as match. And then again, those indirect costs. So really anything that's allowable to be submitted for reimbursement under the grant would also be allowable as match. Next slide. And then the budget narrative. And the budget narrative is really, really important. I think that sometimes with grants in general, we don't spend as much time on that, and grant reviewers really do spend a lot of time on the budget narrative. We want you to provide a detailed information to justify each line item in your budget for the implementation of the year one grant. It's important to show your calculations to assist grant reviewers in understanding how the numbers were developed in your grant. In-kind match must have a verifiable value. Another thing I want to stress is, again, if you're applying for your coordinator as a shared position, that needs to be clear in your budget narrative and in the job description. We're looking for all of that to line up. And, it's not just making sure that your calculations are there and easy to understand. It's also, this is a competitive grant process. And we're asking you to sort of tell us what you need. The amount that you can apply for, we tell you to apply within a range of $50,000. So the $50,000 isn't a cap, it's more of a guide. And we're asking you to tell us, you know, why there's need there for each of the items that you're requesting. And then just making sure that that really kind of lines up with what our funding priorities are. Next slide. So these are just some resources if you're interested in reading more about collective impact theory itself and kind of gaining some understanding before you try to tackle writing the grant. And then there's also some partner resources. These slides are meant to serve as a resource. So in addition to the recording, we will go back and share the slides with you so that you can access these links. Some of these will be in the RFP as well, but we wanted to give you as much as we could now so that you could start thinking and preparing and talking to your partners if you do want to go ahead and apply. Next slide. This is our contact information. So Christina is the director of the Community Engagement Division. Again, I'm the lead on LCAN, and Megan is a consultant on with a lot of our LCANs around the state. Please feel free to email us anytime. We're happy to set up a time to chat more one-on-one virtually. And then I think I included on the next slide an idea of sort of next steps or what we're moving ahead to. Maybe I didn't. But the next big thing to be watching for would be that the RFP will be available April 1st. And then the application process itself will take place from May to June. We will be reviewing applications from June to July. So that is it in a nutshell. I think we've talked to you for quite a while. So at this time, I would just like to open it up for any questions that you might have. And if there aren't any questions, then we'll just give you a little bit of extra time today and say thank you so much for joining us. And we really would love to talk to you individually and hear more about, you know, what you're thinking in terms of building an LCAN. So thank you so much and have a great day.